All right, good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to the Lakewood City Schools Literacy Night. My name is Stephen Ost. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning. I'd like to take a couple moments and acknowledge some of our guests, as well as introduce you to our team that will be meeting with you. First, a big thank you and an acknowledgement to our Board of Education members that are here with us. So, Board President Michael Callahan in the back, Board Member Nora Katzenberger. We are so fortunate in our school district to have a Board of Education that values public education and is committed to supporting and serving our community. And their attendance tonight is just another example of that. So thank you for being here. Our district superintendent, our esteemed leader, Maggie Nitzwitzki, is back there, and she has really made sure that our team is paying attention to all the developments, both on the science side of things as well as the legal side of things related to the dyslexia legislation, best practices and literacy instructions. So we thank her for her guidance and leadership as this is an exciting time in reading instruction across our educational world. The team that you'll have an opportunity to hear from this evening includes our Assistant Superintendent, Christine Palumbo, who's standing there in the back. She'll be leading one of the tables. We'll have a short presentation here, and then we'll break into groups, and you'll have the opportunity to meet with her. Other members of our team include our Director of Student Services, Lisa Bruning, who is back there. I think she made sure all of our H2O students and some of your children made it upstairs safely. She'll also, you can wave to her.
They're making sure no one laughs.
Sometimes when you plan things, you don't always think. Hey, at least you'll know where they're at. Joining Lisa at the table will be one of our school psychologists, Kristen Beeler, who's located right over here. Joining me at the table later today will be one of our teaching and learning coordinators, who is the lead for elementary education, that's Kristen Clark. And then I'd also like to recognize our multisensory literacy specialist, Christine McElwee. She not only is she an intervention specialist in our schools, but she also helps provide professional learning opportunities for our teachers. She is a Wilson trainer, so she has put in hours and hours, months, years into this profession, and she shares that expertise with our team. Other, resources, obviously we want to provide a lot of information tonight. This presentation, this video, which adds a little stress to my part, will be available online after the presentation. We also will have some baskets at the table down there and note cards. Obviously in a presentation and rotation, we won't be able to get to everyone's questions, so we're collecting questions so we can build an FAQ. And then even afterward, feel free to email any one of us, and we can add those questions to the FAQ just so we can make information available to people that weren't able to join us this evening. As we start this presentation, a few years ago, our community worked as a team with our teachers, administration, their neighbors, and ultimately we came up with our vision of a Lakewood graduate. This continues to be the guidepost for all our work. And as we revisit this slide, no matter what meeting you go to, oftentimes we bring this front and center. I think it's especially important to go back to this because I think everyone would agree that literacy and that skill of reading and being able to understand and communicate with people is at the core of this. Obviously one of the competencies, communication, directly relates to it. But I think as you look at the vision of a Lakewood graduate, literacy is so central and so important to all of these competencies in our work with students. Our objectives this evening, we want to do two things. First of all, we want to talk a little bit about the research and the legislation and how those changes have impacted our practices. So things that we're doing currently in our classroom, things that our team has been involved in from a professional learning standpoint, from new materials that our students are working with, as well as where we're headed in the future. This isn't You read the new research and you learn some new things, you attend a couple webinars, you get trained, and then all of a sudden you flip a switch. We want to be very thoughtful as we go through both making sure that our team is well trained, as well as making sure that they have the best possible materials to work with our students. These objectives highlight that. We'll be talking a little bit about how the research related to the science of reading has impacted our practices, and how the guidelines and the legislation has impacted some of the things that we're required to do as a district, and how we're going to implement those. So just to touch on the science of reading, and this slide wants to provide a little history and perspective, but hopefully also I think in today's day and age it can be lost that the science of reading is this new development, when in reality Blaise Pascal, back in the 17th century, and Blaise I think is most famously known as a French mathematician, started unpacking words in their different sounds. So the phonemes that are attached to the graphemes, so the sounds attached to the letters that we use in our language. In the 18th century, that conversation continued as scholars were trying to make sure that we had common pronunciations in holy text. So the science of reading terminology started to appear. Later on, you had Noah Webster. If you think of the famous Webster's Dictionary, Noah Webster started looking at how words could be broken into parts. So the idea of phonics started to be being developed. Ironically, as we're about to talk about the science of reading, Horace Mann, who's often connected and thought of as one of the biggest champions of public education, he was very much into whole word kind of thinking, and he actually expressed that if you broke words into parts, somehow you'd be taking away the opportunities for students to become more intelligent. So it's interesting kind of how far back into history some of these conversations debate. And then if you look at the 1930s, obviously the very well-known Gordon Gillingham, so then you see the study of multisensory language, and more specific and I would say very explicit approaches to teaching phonics and breaking apart words. In the 90s, and really it kind of started in the 1970s, but it became very controversial in the 1990s. We had kind of what is referenced as the reading wars. So we had the debate between whole language. Should we be doing anything and everything as teachers and telling students to use any part of their text to sort through understanding the words on their page so that they can get to comprehension? And then we had kind of the more traditionalist, saying that we need to take a very explicit approach to making sure that students can decode the words so that they are able to understand those words, and ultimately as they get to decode better, as their language comprehension develops, they'll be able to have better reading comprehension. Dr. Mark Seidenberg's research, The Language at Light Speed, this really kind of was one of the attention-grabbing books in recent history that really started to dive into the brain research and what we have learned about the science, the neuroscience, if you will, of how we learn how to read. This book also highlighted some of these misconceptions of like the cueing system and using kind of clues, context around words that perhaps you weren't familiar with. That wasn't the way we need to be teaching our kids to read. Seidenberg's research also kind of was a call to action that schools needed to, schools and educators specifically needed to learn more about the science of reading so that they would be better prepared to teach students the important skills related to reading. Dr. Hollis Scarborough's research, a dedicated researcher and author through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, probably most famous for the Scarboroughs Rope, brought the idea that when we think of reading, we have all these individual skills that, when woven together, create this multifaceted cognitive skill of reading. And that's broken into our language skills, as well as, and let me skip to that, so we have our language comprehension skills and our word recognition skills. So if you're not familiar with the Scarboroughs Rope, it's up there on the screen. Depending on how that looks, that one side might be a little small, but basically you have all these different skills related to language comprehension. And if you tie those into being able to decode words or recognize words, then ultimately you'll be able to be a skilled reader and you'll be able to comprehend. Which this supports the simple view of reading, which is below, and often is connected when you think of the science of reading. So once again, we shouldn't necessarily be guessing at what words are so that we can make connections with the words around them and then gather reading. As teachers, we need to be very explicit in teaching the different phonemes and making sure that our students can look at the graphemes, the letters, and know the sounds that are attached to those so that they can decode words. And then ultimately, while that's taking place, in Scarborough, really, this diagram, which I think was first done with pipe cleaners, really shows that we have so many of these different independent skills that kind of come together so that we're able to read. So that's the science piece. That's the research that is really telling us as educators, we need to make sure that our students can decode text. We need to make sure that they have strong phonics skills, as well as those important language comprehension skills, and we need to continue to work on their vocabulary, and all that will ultimately come together. The other part of this is across our country, as concerns over the number of students that haven't been able to read has risen, and we've seen these reports come in decade after decade, as our nation compares their reading scores to other countries, and as these different laws come into place. Ohio is one of, I believe, like 42 or 43 states in the country that have laws specific to reading instruction and dyslexia. This was passed recently. The first part of the law defines dyslexia, and you can read that up there. And then it has two major components. It breaks in some responsibilities that the state has, so the Department of Education for the state of Ohio has to do some things, and then school districts have to do some things as well. The state responsibilities included creating a standing Ohio Department of Education Dyslexia Committee, and ultimately that committee would help plan some of the following things that I'll present, but then that committee will also oversee any developments from that as well. They had to create and develop a multisensory structured literacy program professional development. That was introduced to us just this past November, or at least the first part of that was developed or introduced this last November. And that's basically an online professional learning module system for our K-3 teachers. In the very near future, we are told that our 4th grade and up teachers, there'll be some professional learning modules available to them, so they've completed that. The state also in the legislation asked the department to create a dyslexia guidebook. This was a very controversial document. It took them well over a year to create because school districts, you think you have 600 plus school districts across the state of Ohio. They all had their curriculums in place, their beliefs, their thoughts. And so this took a number of revisions, but ultimately this last year, the final version of the Dyslexia guidebook was released. In it captures a lot of the specifics related to the law, but then it also provides suggestions on best practice for solid reading instruction. And that's linked in there. But if you do a quick Google search, you just Google Ohio Department of Education Dyslexia Guidebook, and it would come up pretty quickly if you wanted to see that. So from a school district standpoint, the law has some requirements built into that. The first law is related to screening. So as a school district, we've been screening students related to their reading instruction for some time now. So this isn't necessarily new, but basically some of the things that we explore in the screening process are being updated. And so the state of Ohio has a list of approved dyslexia screeners. And currently we're using iReady and AimsWeb to screen our students. That happens 3 times a year. It happens in the fall, winter, and spring. As you might imagine, with this dyslexia guidebook and the legislation just happening recently, All these assessment companies are working to get their proposals into the state so they can be an approved screener. The law states that by the 2023-24 school year, all K-3 students, anyone who's enrolled in kindergarten after January needs to be screened, and then any student in grades 4 through 6, a parent or a guardian can request that they be screened. And basically you see as the screening is implemented, that requirement just shifts to kindergarten, and then after kindergarten, students either, if there's a concern that a parent has, then the district has a responsibility to screen them upon request and with parent permission. So if a teacher notices something, if a parent notices something, and we need to do an additional screening after that kindergarten year, not next year, but the year after, then at that point, with parental permission, we would proceed with the screening. Related to Tier 2 screening, so what I refer to as kind of our universal screening that we'll be doing for dyslexia. So once again, next year, all students kindergarten through 3rd grade. After that, it would be all students kindergarten. We do the iReady screening, which basically measures our students' performance and their achievement in the reading areas. We do that K to 8, and we'll be continuing to do that as well. But this kind of gives you an idea of what the state expectations are. For Tier 2 screening, every student identified as risk, and basically if they're not showing significant progress towards their reading and writing skills, especially after 6 weeks of intervention, then at that point we would do a Tier 2 screening. The next thing that the state asked districts to do was to make sure that teachers are trained. And if you go back to Seidenberg's research and his book, one of the big things that he said was, one of the problems we have is, teachers are trying to do the best they can. They want kids to be able to learn, they want them to be able to master content, but at the end of the day, they're working with the best knowledge that they have. And so related to this, the state, said, hey, we need to make sure that all of our teachers are trained. So from a professional development standpoint, our teachers either need to be certified in a structured literacy approach that the district selects, or they need to complete 18 hours of these professional development modules that the state created. So by next school year, all of our kindergarten and 1st grade staff need to have completed that. By the following year, our 2nd grade and 3rd grade staff will need to have completed that. And then by that third year, all of our intervention specialists, grades 4 through 12. We have an upcoming professional development day. We've introduced this professional development plan for our staff already. And some of them, I received a few certificates that a few of our teachers actually completed just this past week. And then our teachers will be given time at that professional development day in February to work on the modules. And then we have a host of dates available to our teachers to engage in completing those modules, in the relatively near future. We've invited all teachers to start that training. Obviously, to meet the state guideline with K1 initially, but we believe that the professional development is of quality and of importance that we wanted to engage our entire team as soon as possible. The other thing is the school district needed to have a multisensory structured literacy certification process for our teachers. So once again, the teachers can either complete that 18 hours of professional learning modules that the state of Ohio provides through their learning management system, or a teacher can complete that certification process. We are very blessed as a district to have Christine McElwee as a Wilson Level 2 trainer. If you visit our teaching and learning website, at the bottom of that website, you'll see our district's literacy plan. And I can tell you, having the opportunity to work in a few other school districts, it is very rare, and I should have counted the number, and I think this screenshot, there's actually 1 or 2 individuals that are also Wilson certified. But if you visit the website, you can see all the staff that we have here that have already completed that training. And I can't overstate how difficult that training is. It's a commitment that you have to go through the professional learning process, you have to be observed, you have to work in collaboration with the trainer. So this is a very intensive process, and to have this many members of our team complete that process is very unusual. In previous districts I've worked at, we consider ourselves lucky to have one person on staff that had that training. The Wilson reading certification will be, or I shouldn't say it will be, it is our multisensory literacy certification process that we've adopted. I imagine most people, and I hope everyone enjoyed the history teacher and me, but I imagine most people are more interested in, hey, what's happening at Lakewood or what's going to be happening in the future. So while I'm a very engaging speaker, I can tell by all your eyes, but we want to make this a little more interactive. So we're going to move our presentation down to 3 tables. And basically, the 3 stations are going to cover what do we want our students to learn. And that table is going to look at reading instruction, both where we're at now, some of the professional development that our team has done and will be doing, along with some shifts that we're anticipating making in the near future. And then the next question is educators, how do we know if they have learned what we want them to learn? And then what do we do if they still need some practice or they still need to work on that? So that'll be the multi-tiered systems of support table. And then lastly, what do we do if we suspect there might be a learning disability? And so there'll be a table looking at the relationship between dyslexia and an identification for an SLD in reading.
Lisa Bruning, I'm the Director of Student Services for the district, and then
I'm Kristen Beeler, I'm a school psychologist for the district.
We have 8 school psychologists. I'm looking at you.
Yeah, we have 8 right now.
Okay,
we have a good number.
Yeah, we have a really nice number here in Lakewood, so that every school, pretty much, psychologists only have to share 2 buildings, and that's not typically how a lot of districts are, but they do so much more than just the evaluation piece. So we're going to talk a little bit, or Kristen is going to talk a little bit about it, regarding dyslexia, the diagnosis, the disability, and what special education looks like, and how you might go about it, or what kind of the procedures would be. With that said, we have 10 minutes, and then I think a buzzer is going off. And at that buzzer, just to make things really complicated, you're going to all move, not us, that might have been easier, all of you, and you're going to go to the black table, and then you'll be there for the next session, okay? All right, so I'm going to turn it over to
Sure.
Kristen.
I don't know if we want to talk just about the term dyslexia, if there's a specific start point that you want me to have, just like the big 5 in reading in general, which we always talk about. What are the big 5 components of learning to read? Would that be helpful? When we look at and we talk about the big 5, we talk about things like phonemic awareness, which is understanding that the letters in words make sounds. So you start first with learning language auditorily, so you hear it. Phonological awareness, how do the sounds sound, and you practice things like rhyming and blending, segmenting. So you'll hear oftentimes preschoolers, kindergartners doing nursery rhymes, kind of acquiring that understanding of sound symbol awareness. And then we move into letters and sounds, how those work together, and ultimately then you can put them together. We do like nonsense words. You've probably heard your kids talk about those, where they're not real words, but you want them to be able to tap out the sounds in those words to help understand how phonics basically will come to play. So when you have a fake word like sim, I was just working with a kid the other day, and you tap it out, and then sim, and you know it makes the word. So when they get to word reading, they've understood or learned that the letters have kind of rules or relationships in the sound. So that's how they word attack ultimately. Vocabulary plays a role in that. Ultimately, the goal would be to create fluent readers. So when they learn the sounds in words, they learn how to blend them and segment and do all of that. They then can do it in what we call oral reading fluency, which I think most people are most familiar with, which is how you're able to then read more fluently. The goal being you can read with fluency, kind of automaticity, awareness, which then lends itself to comprehension. So for us, we're often looking at where is there potentially a break in that chain that we need to support. And for dyslexia specifically, word recognition comes into play. When kids have a difficult time with those components of language, we're looking at, can they do those simple word recognition skills? If it's breaking down at the phonics or the phonemic awareness level, what does that tell us? What interventions can we put into play? Are they responding to those interventions, or do we need to look at the frequency, the intensity, what's going on? Because often as they get older, we'll see comprehension might be impacted, and we think, oh, it's a comprehension weakness. A lot of times we have to back up a little bit down the chain and realize maybe it's not comprehension, maybe we just need to help them with how they approach and attack words. So those are some of the things from a basic overarching standpoint, when it comes to the big five in reading, the term, I don't know if we want to talk about specific learning disability. Is that maybe a good,
Yeah, why don't we,
or do you
yeah.
was there a specific thought you have on that?
I know because I've had several questions come through the office in terms of, can the school diagnose dyslexia? What does that look like if we are looking at it? So maybe just kind of talk about what our end is in terms of when we look at a disability and the word dyslexia and now what we are able to do versus
Sure.
what we.
Tell me if I'm going in the right direction as I
tell
go.
you. I will tell you.
And some of you may have worked with me. I know I'm sitting across the table from some parents that I've sat with, and we've talked about these things. For me, one of the things, like the word dyslexia isn't new necessarily in our process. It's new in the law that has now come out to make sure that we're not missing students or kind of looking more intricately at their reading skills. But dyslexia has always been something that we look at when we assess for reading weaknesses. So for us, if a parent may come and say, I suspect my child has dyslexia, what we do is we initiate, if their team collectively suspects that there could potentially be a disability, we will look at these very specific areas of reading through our assessment. And what we're trying to identify is there a reading weakness in general? Is there a reading disability? And when we are looking at that, the term specific learning disability in the school setting includes that definition of dyslexia. So we don't have a special category that we check on our box that just says dyslexia. We have it under the umbrella of specific learning disability. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that capture that part?
And I guess as we're looking at all of this, so children, adults can have dyslexia, and at times.
Well, you have it for the rest of your entire life. It
Yes,
doesn't go
yes.
away.
So
Okay.
my middle daughter, who is now a nurse at UH, has dyslexia. She was on an IEP. She could memorize words. She was great at a rote spelling test because she could memorize enough to get them down. What she couldn't do was break them apart again. Like they didn't make sense to her outside of that. So she went on an IEP. She truly learned all kinds of different skills in the area of reading. She now, even to this day, as a nurse, color codes her different things. When she would read a book, her main characters had one color, her other things she was looking for had a different color. Everything went, eventually that IEP we pulled away from because she was reading at grade level, she had her supports and she had her tools, and then went on to Bowling Green and received her nursing degree and moved on. Is she still a reader who has difficulties? And just until maybe the last couple of years, it wasn't even a joy. Like she'd be like, oh, pick me out something at the library, and I'd be like, oh, no matter what I pick out, you don't like it. We're all bad. And now she's kind of finding a joy in reading. Up to that point, reading was such a struggle that it was not something she enjoyed doing. So as we look at things, though, and when we looked at her, that specific learning disability, that category in the area of reading is what we're looking at. And then more important to us is where is that need? What is it? What are the supports? What are the skills that we need to go back to work with that student so that they can become a fluent reader? Or have the tools to know when I see a word I don't know and I'm in a college text, how do I decode that word? Because there aren't all the other things that might go with it, pictures or things that might help me. So just kind of throw some of that in there as we look. So.
Yeah, that term decoding is a huge piece of the puzzle for us. Can they take letters and sounds and be able to do things like tap out nonsense words? Sometimes we will have students who, like you said, can do word recognition, where they can read words because they've learned to sort of see words that are familiar in their environment and deduce what they mean, or they're just familiar because they're frequent in their day-to-day text. And ultimately, we want to look back sometimes if we see a struggling reader at their decoding skills. Can they truly understand the rules of how letters and sounds go together, whether it's a real word or not? And if they can do it in nonsense words, it usually will tell us that they should be able to decode. And if they're not, it just is another clue along the way. But oftentimes, we are in that nonsense word kind of decoding space where we're intervening, and what a lot of the interventions like Mr. Ask talk about today serve, so that we can get to that point that your daughter
Can I
is.
ask a question?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So with that, with what you just said, and if you guys are using iReady to assess, if your child is dyslexic or a low reader, like how do you see that in their iReady. Like, it is, like, because my kid is dyslexic, and you would put a word in front of him, and you would put what, and he couldn't even tell you what the first sound was. So it's more of them being able to read it out
speak it.
loud and speak it. And if you're doing an iReady test, like, that doesn't, because then you guys are gonna have to filter out who's dyslexic and then who is just a low reader, right?
Well, in the end,
Because they're different, because you're born dyslexic, and being a low reader has probably other things that go with that.
and so there are different skills that we may be looking at in terms of what we'd be looking at if they were to move into, say, special education. But in the end, all what we're really trying to dig down with iReady and do some back testing if we see something like, wow, they did really well here, but this it's not showing in other things. We're going to be doing some back testing to dig down deeper into some areas where, whoa, look at here. When we went back, we see that there are still some, like, phonics, some decoding. Something is not there, and what do we need to do to support that and teach that specific skill?
So iReady is your tier 1 assessment, and then you would dig deeper with some other screeners.
And Ames, yeah,
With
and
Ames
Ames
Web.
Web.
So
Yeah.
to speak to that piece, we have universal progress or universal screening benchmarking, but it's Ames Web. So Ames Web is how we do that nonsense word piece where we whittle it down. iReady is a supplemental tool to that. They both work, but Ames Web is our first screening point. iReady is a tool that then we look at and cross-reference with it. So iReady doesn't necessarily measure oral reading fluency. It looks at some of those phonics skills, but in a slightly different way. So when we have a question with an iReady score, the teams that look at the data know we need to be looking at that 1 minute progress or that 1 minute benchmark probe first. That gives us very specific finite data, and then we can kind of use the iReady to help set their personal pathway to match what their true ability is within a 1 minute, highly research-based correlated probe. Does that kind of answer it in a quick way? So iReady's not the only point that we're using.
So,
All right, welcome everyone. So this is the teaching and learning team, if you will, or part of our team, I guess. So once again, I'm Stephen Oss, Director of Teaching and Learning. This is Kristen Clark. She's the lead for our elementary. She's the Teaching and Learning Coordinator. And really what we have for you is we wanted to give everyone kind of a sense of what we're doing now, as well as what potential changes we'll be looking at. So as I introduce this first handout, which has our vision of a Lakewood graduate on top, you'll see within that chart is our reading instruction. And basically what's happened post-pandemic is as we've working to try and address our reading instruction as it relates to the recent update and research from the Science of Reading, as well as the state's legislation. Some of these involve changes that we've just put in place this year. And then as you can look towards the bottom, we're anticipating, some changes moving forward. So if you look at phonological awareness, this is an example where, this past year, we made the decision to implement Hegarty K2 across the board, where in the past Hegarty was something we were using with students that we identified as perhaps at risk or needing more support. But now that is something we're using with all of our students. And then as you go through here, it's not just kind of programs or materials we're using, but you'll see some instructional strategies or activities in here as well. When you look at phonics, one thing that might catch your eye is the fact that we have both K2 phonics units of study as well as grades 2 and 3 foundations. We just added foundations this year across the board. Basically what was happening pre-pandemic is we were in the transition. We were starting to transition our phonics program, and then the pandemic happened, and so as we were shifting to remote learning, we had some buildings that were doing the phonics units of study, we had some buildings that were doing foundations, and then we got to worry about remote learning, hybrid learning, and then as we're shifting back. That's why, it's probably not something that you traditionally see is two different phonics programs in play. That's currently what we have. We're anticipating in the near future that we shift to one of those moving forward, and that's something that we're going to work with our team to kind of finalize in the upcoming months for next school year. When you look at fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, you get a sense of some of the different activities and strategies we utilize with our students to strengthen those skills. At the bottom, this highlights some of the professional learning and curriculum materials that we're either working on now or will be shifting to. For example, this past year, or this past school year, I should say, we were working with grade level teams to introduce and provide resources related to orthographic mapping. Our department purchased decodable text for our elementary school classrooms. So we're trying to get more resources and training in the hands of our teachers kind of as we're going through these changes or shifts. As I mentioned up there, all of our K-3 classroom teachers, as well as our intervention small group instructors, our intervention specialists, and that's K-12 intervention specialists, I should say. They'll complete that 18 hours of professional learning modules if they haven't completed the literacy certification process. One thing that we're starting in the next couple weeks is we're going to start our curriculum adoption for ELA. So our plan is to have some things like Haggerty in our phonics program in place, and then explore curriculum materials for the rest of our ELA program. We're going to start that by meeting with each of our building teams through a listen and learn process. What do you like about our current curriculum materials? What do we really need to explore based on what we've learned recently related to the science of reading? What things should we prioritize? Would you like to be a part of the committee? That's going to be a big ask. We're already very fortunate to have one of our teachers who's going to help facilitate this process. We think it's very important to have teachers engaged throughout the entire way to make sure that we capture and get the best possible materials for our students, and that they have confidence in utilizing those. With each adoption, so basically this spring we'll be identifying our committee. We'll be selecting 2 or 3 curriculums to trial next year, and then by the end of next school year we'll be selecting an ELA curriculum materials for adoption the following school year. With that comes a lot of professional learning related to those materials to make sure that they support the instructional practices in the classroom. And then, as I mentioned, and Christine McElwee's here, she's providing ongoing professional learning, both supporting our teachers in the completion of those 18 hours of professional learning modules, as well as supporting them with some explicit learning related to phonics instruction and phonemic awareness instruction. So we're very, very lucky to have her. And I think at this point we wanted to kind of provide some examples and resources for ways that you can support reading at home. So I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Yeah, so on the next couple pages, it's 11 ways that parents can help their students at home. I'm going to highlight 6 and 7. So teaching phonemic awareness and teaching phonics through a simple strategy that you can do at home and even make it into a game. But it's called orthographic mapping. So orthographic mapping kind of uses like the individual sounds of words and what that looks like in print to kind of create, fluent readers. But this is a way to do it so that it stores into their long-term memory. So it's a simple formula: tap it, map it, graph it. So you might say, okay, let's graph the word cat. And so you'll ask your student or your child, how many sounds are in the word cat? So you'll sound it out, at. And then you will have them color, how many circles. So you're also incorporating some one-to-one correspondence, which is math, so a little bit of number sense. So 1, 2, 3. And then, okay, so let's spell the word with each of those individual sounds. So k, at, and then you've got this. So this is like, a pretty simple word, right? But let's say we were going to use like a word that's irregular and maybe hard for kids to read and also to spell. So let's use what. So how many sounds are in the word what? So you do t. Okay, so how many sounds? Color in 3 circles, and then let's spell it. So WH go in the same because that's the same sound, or that's one sound. AT. Okay, but you might even talk about like, well, that A doesn't sound like what we normally think A sounds like. So then, you can underline it, have a conversation with your child about it. Well, I wonder why A sounds like a U. But through that conversation, it's really reinforcing the word what in your students' minds and their long-term memory. So you can even have them pick words. You could have them pick objects in the house. My children are 6, and I do this sometimes with my kids, and they sometimes get sick of it, but they also have fun with it too, especially when they get to pick the word. So just a simple routine that you could do at home that teachers are also doing in the classroom.
And I think, especially when you're reading with your child, I have a 7-year-old, that's my youngest, when they come across that word that they don't know, just that sounding out the different, graphemes that they're seeing and working with them on those sounds just kind of supports, what they'll be learning in the classroom. The other thing I would mention related to this, because if you're like me, sometimes you'll see it once or hear it, you're like, oh yeah, that sounds great, and then you have that book out in your lap and you're sitting there with your kid and you're like, wait a second, what was that? If you do a Google search for orthographic mapping, or even heart words, which heart words are great because those are some of those irregular sounds that are in there. There's so many great resources on YouTube where somebody else is kind of modeling that. And at times I've, shown, last year my kindergartner, this year she's a first grader, but I pulled a couple of those up last year just to kind of see how it worked with her. I have my little guinea pig. So that's a great resource. The other thing is this handout, 11 Ways, it comes from the Reading Rockets website. That's an excellent resource. To find some great strategies, tips, resources. If you ever have a question or there's more information that you'd like about that. So, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming out. Anytime you plan one of these, you're a little nervous. How many people show up, but this is, we're very pleased that everyone came. And as we mentioned, we'll be building a FAQ. So if there's any questions you think of, please grab a note card and a pen and put them into the basket. And I'm not sure where we're at.
When you said you were gonna hopefully adopt just one of the, did you mean either the phonics units of study or the foundations?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So one will be across the board.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering why foundations wasn't in the younger grades too.
And that's definitely a conversation we're having.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had one go through foundations and one go through study.
Differences. Yeah. And that's why, and I think I mentioned it now that I've done this twice, I'm not sure what I've mentioned. So this year we've adopted Haggerty across the board and we added foundations across the board. So that is the direction.
Can you tell me again what Haggerty is? I don't remember what the teacher said that was. Haggerty?
Yeah, it's a phonemic awareness program, so just kind of developing an understanding, that you have sounds that are attached to letters. Yeah.
That word, I'm just not putting it together with the concept.
So the program, when it's implemented, there's kinesthetic movements along with saying different words and there's weekly there's an area of focus for each week, so it progresses really nicely throughout the year.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thank you all.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Welcome, Purple Group. I'm Dr. Christine Colombo. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for the district, and my job in these next few minutes is to talk with you about multi-tiered systems of support. Wanted to first make sure that you were aware that on the table are index cards. We likely won't have time for questions, so please feel free to write any questions down that you might have and put them into the basket. We will develop what we call an FAQ, or a frequently asked questions, so that we can make sure that everybody gets questions answered. So there are two things I want to talk with you about. The first one is multi-tiered systems of support. And what this handout demonstrates for us is that multi-tiered systems of support is RTI, response to intervention. Sometimes you'll hear that called RTII, response to instruction and intervention. So multi-tiered systems of support is RTI, which Lakewood has done for years and years. It is also PBIS, which is Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports or Strategies. And the other thing that, which is also something that Lakewood has in every single one of our elementaries, is PBIS or Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. So when we talk about multi-tiered systems of support, we think about the universal screening in literacy that Mr. Ost talked about. And in Lakewood, for years and years and years, we have been doing universal screening for students, fall, winter, spring. And when you are delivering high quality instruction that is reaching your students, the goal would be that about 80% of your students are on track, right? We recognize that you're going to have some students who are not on track, maybe 15% or so, that would require what we call targeted intervention. And then finally, you're going to have a smaller percent, hopefully not more than 5% of your students that are extremely not on track. Like we have some significant concerns that this particular student or these particular students will not be reading at grade level prior to the end of their school year. So these particular students are provided what we call intensive intervention. And in Lakewood, for years, when we deliver targeted intervention, that is a group size of 5 to 7 students. So every one of our elementary buildings has what we call an IE block, or an intervention and enrichment block. So at that grade level, there is a 40-minute period where students are either receiving enrichment or intervention. If I am in this area, likely I don't need intervention, my teacher can provide me with enrichment. If I am in this area, I need some targeted intervention in a group of 5 to 7 students. I would get that daily. If I'm in this area, more intensive intervention, I would also get this daily. My group size, however, would be only 1 to 3 students. So that is, these students would likely be receiving enrichment with their teacher. This group of students would receive targeted intervention. This group of students would receive intensive intervention. And the other thing that's important to recognize is if I'm in this targeted group, my provider, my intervention provider, is monitoring my progress by administering a measure from AIMSweb, a very brief, like 1 minute, how do you do on this particular skill? That would happen every other week. If I'm in this group here, I need intensive intervention, and my progress is monitored weekly. So the intervention provider is delivering that measure to me on a weekly basis, so we can really get a sense of, are we starting to see growth? Are we beginning to move this child just ever so slightly more toward being on track to read at grade level at the end of their year? So the other thing that I think is important to point out is when a student is receiving intensive intervention, we use specific programming. And the specific programming that we do use is either the Wilson Reading System, or for younger students, potentially a program that is developed by the Wilson Reading, for younger students, which is called Foundations. And some of you may be familiar with Foundations because that's also something that can be used in the classroom. But when we look at intensive intervention, we're very prescriptive about what programs we use. And Mr. Ost had spoken about Wilson Level 1 certification. And Mrs. McElwee is with us at the table. She is our multi-sensory literacy instruction specialist. She has trained probably every one of those teacher names that's on the website, and it's about 20 teachers. She does a 3-day, here are the basics of Wilson, and then in order to get your level 1 certification, it is a year-long process where Mrs. McElwee, who is highly trained by Wilson, has gone to Massachusetts to participate in her training. She will basically, they engage in a practicum, and she monitors during their practicum time period. She goes and watches them deliver the program with students and then provides them with feedback, and Wilson leans on her to make the determination of, is this person worthy is the only word that comes to my mind, but have they done what they need to do, and are they using the program, able to deliver the program with fidelity so that we can say that they are level 1 certified. And as Mr. Ost shared, most districts are lucky if they have one teacher who is level 1 certified. When you go on our website and you see on the teaching and learning page, you see the list of staff. We're close to 20 staff members that are level 1 trained, and I believe we have 2 to 3 that are level 2 trained, which is even more in depth. So one of the things that I said earlier was, years ago, the district had the foresight and the commitment to approach an amazing teacher and say, listen, you are a wonderful teacher, you're passionate about literacy, you're passionate about this program, we would like to invest in you and get you expertly trained by Wilson. And that has served us so well, and is really one of the main cornerstones of the intervention that we provide to our students who are really in need of that intensive level of intervention. So it is now 7:10. We don't have time for questions, but please, jot anything you want on those cards. We're happy to process questions, put them into the FAQ. And thank you so much for being here tonight, because this was really a wonderful opportunity. Thank you.